Alright guys, last class we talked about the different parts of the flowering plant. You guys just did a lab that covered the different parts of the flower. What we're going to do now is cover a little bit of some other things that have to do with flower reproduction. Any of the notes or anything that you don't get today will be on the portal, so as you follow along, please listen to my voice, and what the things I'll say will be useful to fill in your blanks. But if you don't get the information, you can go on the portal. This video or the notes actually filled in will be on the portal as well. So as we look at the different parts of the flower, the first one we're going to look at is the sepal. When I think of sepal, I always think of a steeple. Steeple is like the top part of a church where the cross is that kind of protects. The sepal is its job is to protect the flower before it opens up. So it protects the flower prior to it opening up. And a lot of times, this part will actually fall off and die after it's served its purpose. You can see another sepal down there, but it's a fleshy material. Sometimes it looks leafy, and once again, the sepal's job is to protect the flower before it's open. Here's another image of that. You can see them here and here. Sometimes they actually will be part of the flower, the design of the flower, but a lot of times as well they'll fall off. In your lab that you just did, the sepal was actually still attached. The petals' job, their job is to attract the pollinating insect. That is their function. A lot of times we think of petals as being brightly colored and smelling nice, but it just depends on the pollinator. Most pollinators will be your insects, but not all. And so if you're going to attract a fly or something disgusting like that, you're going to need a different scent, a different texture. If it's maybe you need pollinated at night. Well, if that's the case, you're not going to need bright flowers because the organism won't see. You have a lighter colors and then a larger flower with a pretty strong scent. So the petals, their job is to attract, and just depending on the pollinator, usually the petals and the flower itself have co-evolved with whatever it is that does the pollinating for the species. Now what's interesting is we may not see some of the usefulness of a petal. In this case you can see the flower on the left looks pretty plain and boring, but when you look at it underneath under UV light, what ends up happening is it looks like a bullseye. And especially from flying up above, whether it's an insect or bird, both can see any UV light. They see that, they zone in, and they go in there for the nectar. They'll rub up against the anthers, and in doing so, help with pollination. Okay. The stamens, when you think about that, should be the male part of the flower. And the other thing that you need to know with this is the pollen, where it's actually made, is up here in the anther. So in your notes it says the plant makes pollen, the top part of the stamen, and we call that the anther. And it's spelled right over here, but it's A-N-T-H-E-R. This test sets itself up for a matching section, and so you will know how to identify the different parts, like pollen, which would be the small grains kind of up here, the petal, the sepal, which is back here, ovary. This whole thing is the stamen. The filament is what holds it up here. The anther is that top part here. The pistil, we talk about that as the entire thing. The stigma is the opening in the hole, and the style is that section here. All of those things are going to have to be known. If you look at at the end of your note packet, the very last page, there's actually a giant diagram with all those things. Could be useful for you to know that for our next test. The stigma, I think of stigmata, right? The hole in Christ's hands. The stigma is the top of the female part. It's the opening. And it's where pollination actually occurs. Pollination is the movement of pollen into or on the stigma. I always associate this in this way. Pollination and fertilization are not the same thing. A lot of times people want to associate those two things as the same. They're not. It's just like in animals, copulation and fertilization are not the same. Not all pollinizations lead to fertilizations, and not all copulations between two animals leads to fertilization. So just because a plant has a pollen grain that reaches the stigma of another female plant does not mean that fertilization has occurred. The next one that you get to know is the ovary. If you look down your notes, its job, and you look at it here, is to protect the ovum. And basically what will end up happening is, and I'll get more into this, but when a pollen lands on here, one of the cells in the pollen, there's actually going to be three, is going to form what we call a pollen tube. And that's this thing that runs right through here. It's going to go through the plant itself, through this style. The style is solid plant material. Come down here, lead a tube eventually to the ovary, which will then go to the oval to allow for fertilization to occur. The pollen will travel to the oval and fertilization takes place. Fertilization is going to be the uniting of the sperm cell that's found in the pollen grain with the egg. That's fertilization. Pollinization is just pollen landing here. The next step is fertilization. So there is that difference, okay? Notice there is a difference. If fertilization occurs, then that's where you get seeds, which will be our next lab. Make sure you bring your lab book with you. All right, so here's that diagram as I mentioned. If you turn to the last page in your notes, page 6, you'll actually see this diagram along with the next two that we're going to see. I would almost bet $1 million, that you'd see a diagram just like this on our next test, where instead of having names here, there are numbers, and then a matching section that you would have to, with the letter A would be for pistil, and you'd have to know that this one right here refers to the pistil. So put this in here just to kind of give you a heads up, probably going to be on our next test. All right, when we look at the gametophyte, so the production of a gamete, it's different between male parts of the plant and female. The female gametophyte happens in the ovary and it produces ovules, which can become seeds if fertilized. And then one of the things that we need to realize is that a diploid in the oval divides by meiosis to produce 4 haploid spores. And so just think back to that mitosis terms that we used. Diploid is the full complement. It's going to divide by meiosis, reducing the number to an haploid spores. Those haploid spores, one of those spores will be called a megaspore, and it will actually survive. That megaspore will then divide through a process of mitosis, making exact copies of itself. Remember, mitosis produces exact copies as each other and to the parent, and it will eventually produce 8 nuclei, and then one of those nuclei will become the egg. The terms that you need to fill out here, the first one, ovals here, a diploid, as I mentioned, diploid, divides via meiosis to produce 4 haploid, and then we call that one spore a megaspore. And that megaspore will divide again and to produce 8 nuclei, and eventually one of them will become the egg. And you can see that on the next diagram. Along with this diagram is in the back of your notes as well. Here's that diagram here. So that megaspore is one of the original that actually is picked right there. It will go through a process of mitosis 3 times, producing 2, 4, and then eventually 8. And we can see those here. One of them will become the egg. The rest is going to be the endosperm, which will become food for that egg cell. Why do we need food? When you put a seed in the ground, it's not going to be able to do photosynthesis, therefore not be able to generate energy. So it needs some energy to get the leaves up and running, the factory going. It's some startup money. It's a little walking around money to allow the plant to get going. Abood, wake up. In the male gametophyte, what ends up happening is that the anther and the pollen produce sperm cells, and we call sperm cells in there pollen. So that's the words you need to fill in. How does it work? It's very similar. A diploid cell will divide through a process of meiosis. Meiosis is going to half the number, and what it's going to do is it's going to produce 4 haploid cells, and we call these, this is the next fill-in that you need, microspheres. So notice they're different than the megaspores. The microspores will form. Each of those microspores nuclei will divide by mitosis, okay, and produce these 2 haploid nuclei particles. One of those nuclei. So you get this nuclei. One of those will actually divide again and produce and form what we call a sperm cell. That's our next fill-in spot, sperm cell. And then what will end up happening is all three nuclei will be enclosed in a single pollen grain. When you see a pollen grain, there's actually three things in there. There are these two sperm cells here, along with the pollen tube. And we'll talk about what each one does in the process of fertilization coming up. The pollen lands on the stigma, that's pollinization. The pollen tube is going to make a path, and the sperm will follow through that tube. You can see the diagram here. Generation of the material. This cell right here will divide, creating two sperm cells, there, and then one pollen tube. That entire thing we call pollen. Pollinization is that actually the process of pollen landing on the female part. Okay, and for fertilization, you actually need the sperm cell to get all the way down into the ovum. The pollen grain first must be transferred from an anther, so that's where it's made and produced, to the stigma of the pistil, the female part, the male part. We call that process, and this is your next fill in the blank, pollination. Okay, the transferring of pollen from an anther to the pistil. What will end up happening is, if the pollen grain comes from the same plant, which it can, some plants are more conducive to that. For example, they're not too concerned. The lab that we did, the stigma was actually lowered, shouldn't be an issue. We call that process self, and this is the next blank you have to fill in, pollinization. Okay, self-pollinization is when the pollen from the same plant actually goes to the stigma on the same plant. If it's a different plant, we call that cross-pollinization. Okay? And the one that really, the better of the two, just depending on the situation, self-pollinization is a little bit easier. You don't need a pollinator that much. You could use wind or movement. But the reason we like cross-pollinization, and this is the last blank on this section, is because it increases the variety. So insects are the primary pollinators on our planet, but that's not it. There's a lot of other things that do that. Those are the most common. Okay. The next blank, what are some other things that are common insect pollinators? Well, obviously, if I were to have you guys raise your hands, everybody would get the most common, bees. What else does it? Moths. You can put that in the blank as well. And then along with flies. Things like dragonflies, butterflies, even though they're not butter, or they're not flies, nor are they butter, I guess. But those are some of the three most common. The reason they are good pollinators is because that pollen will stick to their hairy bodies. Pollen has a natural stickiness to it. Plus, the pollinators are coming in to get some food and nectar from the plant itself. And the petals are, as we mentioned earlier, what required to do it. There's a coevolution between the proper attraction between the flower and whatever's doing the pollinating. Now, those are the most common, but there are other things. And if there are other things that do the pollinating, you're going to have a different way to attract them. And the next box, or little space I have on your notes, are the ones that are different than the typical insects. And those are, bats can be pollinators, mice, or other birds. Or all could be pollinator. Hummingbirds, regular just birds that we see around here, mammals and other small rodents, and bats. But if you're using those as your pollinator, you're going to need to attract them. Bats are active at night. They don't have great vision. They're not going to be attracted by pretty pinks and reds. You're going to need to have light colors, a strong scent, and it's also going to have a bigger area for the pollination to occur. So depending on who your pollinator is, it'll vary on how you're going to attract them. Flowers that are not showy, okay, if they don't have a lot of stuff, a lot of times those are going to be pollinated. The last fill-in on this page, wind or flies. There's some kind of different types of flowering plants that really smell bad, smell like crap. The purpose of that, they're trying to attract flies. You can see here this bee, very hairy, covered with pollen. It's going to fly around, maybe even miles, eventually go to another flower of the same type, land, and spread pollen from the first plant to the stigma of the second. Okay, that is a cross-pollination. Right here, people might look at these two things and say, oh, those are hummingbirds. Those are actually hawk moths. They're found in Nebraska. Really sweet. If you see a hummingbird late at night or early in the morning or overnight, it is not a hummingbird. It is a hawk moth. It is a pollinator, and like I said, a really cool one at that. They kind of fly around just like hummingbirds. So these are the typical ones, okay, that we think of. Not typical, are birds, bats, and rodents. One of the things about bats, at the Henry Doorly Zoo, we have bats do the fertilization in the rainforest. And because of that, at night, when not a lot of people are in there are tons of bats flying around doing a lot of pollinating, things like that. So if you ever go to the zoo and you look through the caves, you'll see some bats hanging upside down during the daytime. They're free-ranging at night doing the pollinating. Because of these bats, they actually have pollinated the cocoa tree that's found in the rainforest right by the stingray pond on the bottom level, and it actually produces pods. The flowers that attract bats, notice how different they are. They're white, they're bigger, and they kind of use them to stuff their face in there, have the pollen stick to the sides of their head. Rodents, they're going to be near the ground and have special attraction, usually some food for them other than nectar. I've also seen some flowers, what they'll do is they'll actually hang upside down, kind of like this, so that a moth or a rodent of some kind, like in this case, a little mouse, will walk by underneath it, rub up against it, and aid in pollination. All the things we've talked about is pollination. It's not fertilization. Next class, we're going to talk about how does fertilization occur. So pollination is that point right there. This flower has been pollinated. Fertilization has to have it travel all this distance through the female part of the plant, the style, and then eventually get down to the ovary. How does it do that? Well, in that pollen grain we mentioned, there are two sperm cells and a pollen tube. The pollen tube's job is just to make a pathway down to where the eggs are at. And the term that you'll need to fill in there is when that pollen grain gets down there, we have fertilization. It's when the pollen travels to the ovary and it joins the ovum. That is fertilization, okay? So the fill in the blank word for this page is fertilization. That's all I got for notes. The rest of class, you should be working on a green worksheet. You can work on a partner with this, and it'll be due on Monday along with your lab. Hope you have a great weekend.